So how can I figure out which of the fuel sources I'm using and what ratio I'm using them as? So how can I determine which fuel sources that I'm using? Well, we use the RQ and the RER values. And what this is going to tell me is it's going to tell me what fuel sources am I using for my energetic metabolism. This also tells me what substrates are going to be available for me to use. So the RQ value, or the respiratory quotient, is how much CO2 is being eliminated versus how much O2 is being utilized. And so we have values that tell us what fuel sources we're using based off of that respiratory quotient. Where if I'm using carbohydrates only, I'm exhaling the same amount of CO2 as I'm inhaling oxygen. Now notice that we start getting changes in that RQ value based off of the different types of fuel sources that we might use. Notice that for most fuel sources, we are below 1. However, when we get to what's referred to as the Krebs cycle intermediates, oxaloacetate, OAA, or malate, we get above 1. And that simply is the indication that we're producing more carbon dioxide than is what is being inhaled in the form of oxygen. For most of us, we're usually somewhere around between 1 and about 0.7 when we're physically active. The other way of looking at it is based off of what's referred to as the respiratory exchange ratio, and that's telling me how metabolically flexible I happen to be. And so this is telling me what is the PCO2, what is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the gas exchange relative to the partial pressure of oxygen in the gas exchange. And this is always relative to what the atmospheric PCO2 and PO2 happens to be. And what we can do is we can go ahead and look at what is the respiratory exchange ratio, where if I am predominantly using fat for meeting my energetic demands, I will be around 0.7. If I am flexible, that is, if I'm using all three fuel sources for ATP, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, I'm going to be between 0.7 and 0.9. Now, right now, since most of us are sitting around not doing much, our RER is probably around 0.7 because most of our ATP is going to come from fats because our demand is very low. However, as I start increasing my demand, my RER is going to start to creep closer to that 0.9, which means that my exchange between CO2 and O2 is at about 90%. That is, in terms of the ratio, I'm at a 9 to 10 ratio of O2 inhalation to CO2 exhalation in terms of the partial pressure of gases within that ratio. People who have metabolic syndrome, people who are metabolically inflexible, will always be at that higher level, usually above 0.9, closer to 1. People who are doing high intensity exercise will be above 0.9, will actually be above 1. People who are doing endurance exercise are usually closer to a 0.7, that are usually around 0.7 to about 0.8 in terms of their respiratory exchange ratio. And so for both the RQ and the RER values, we actually have to measure these through a ventilatory exchange machine. And we usually will measure them in a clinical setting. However, we can take that clinical setting and based off of heart rate responses and respiratory responses to distinct levels of exercise intensity, we can estimate what the fuel utilization and what their metabolic flexibility might be. Now, for both metabolic flexibility as well as RQ value, that is fuel source use, it's about what fuel do I have available. So if I'm consuming nothing but lipids, I'm going to be in the ketone and lipid level of RQ values, and I'm going to be in that lower area of RER. If I'm consuming nothing but carbohydrates, I'm going to be in the higher RER and closer to the 1.0 on the RQ value. And so we can determine what types of fuels does the person have available to them, and what type of availability do they have to use those fuels, their flexibility, based off of these gas exchange ratios.